next edition of Kids Brains Mattered. And today we are honored to have Dr. Chris Nowinski here. And Dr. Chris Nowinski, as I talk a little bit about his past, is absolutely, we consider one of the foremost experts on concussive and subconcussive trauma in this nation, and is an enormous resource to our entire population of parents, coaches, and athletic trainers that tune in and receive our emails. Dr. Chris Nowinski is the author of Head Games, Football's Concussion Crisis, from the NFL to the youth leagues. Now, this book was published in 2006, before concussions, CTE was really, even identified back in the day. This gentleman was also a Harvard graduate, a college football player, and a professional wrestler. If I cannot just outline, a myriad, what a journey for this gentleman to come all the way to joining us on this podcast. And we're very, very honored to meet you, Chris. And thank you so much, Doctor, for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure, Bruce. Anything for you, my friend.
Thanks. Hey, for our audience, can you just tell us a quick summary of your journey from, how you got to this position running the foremost research center on CTE and concussive trauma in the world?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm running the foremost research center. That's Dr. Ann McKee. I'm running the foremost advocacy and helping with that. So, yeah, I got into this not because I had medical training, but because I got kicked in the head too much. So I was played every sport growing up, just like you did, and then was lucky enough to be recruited to Harvard. Got out of there without any diagnosed concussions. But when I got a few in a row with WWE, then one that led to permanent symptoms, in trying to research it and trying to get better, I realized that what I had been under the impression a concussion was wrong, and that basically we're all being sort of lied to by the sports industry about how bad these hits to the head could be for us. And so Head Games was my sort of a penance for damaging my brain after going to Harvard with something like professional wrestling. Even though I love it as a form of entertainment, it's risky. And then when I sort of realized that the book developed a plan of hey, we can do all this stuff better. We really care about our kids. We can do, everyone would be happy to change, but the books don't change the world. So we had to really start the foundation to both push the research ahead to convince everyone this was happening, as well as, teach people how to protect athletes, how to protect veterans from these brain injuries. And so it's been a wild journey, and we've been at it for almost 20 years now, but I'm pleased with the success we've had, although, it's not enough, and no one knows that more than you. And so there's still a lot of work ahead of us.
Roger, and I really appreciate the personal connection that you have. It's really different when you have somebody saying, hey, our concussions are bad for athletes, our children are not paying attention. But as a former athlete, and a professional wrestler, activities that, really, really, you've experienced this. So I think coming from you, it means a lot more than from, the typical NIH or CDC scientist that's out there.
You'd be amazed how powerful it is for me to have videos of me going off the top rope through tables and getting hit in the head with chairs as to validating that I know what I'm talking about. As a Ph.D.
It's funny. Nobody's got any videos of me waking up in the middle of a rugby field, running down to make a tackle. I'm going to have to go look for some of those, but you're right. And I think it's the power of your personal experience that lends so much credence to what you're doing at the Concussion Legacy Foundation. Now, just hearing you speak, you have basically, in my opinion, led the community of parents and athletes and coaches in trying to raise awareness about this issue. And and every year we keep hearing about athletes succumbing to mental illness or taking their lives over this. Why has it been so hard to get society to accept the fact that there is extensive amount of concussive trauma in these sports? It is affecting brains. It's hurting enormous chunks of our athletic population, yet we can't get any change. Why do you think this has been so hard, or what kind of obstacles have you been able to overcome in your journey?
Yeah, well, there's a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that people, don't change as quickly as science changes. So if you grew up believing a certain thing, it's really hard to change your mind on this. And so there's only a certain percent of the population is even opening to changing their mind on this. And so part of this is we got to get people young and help them it's sort of like thinking about seatbelts, and things that are generational changes. Generational change is sort of natural in terms of changing how we behave as a culture. There's the other part that, there really has been a robust effort to make us forget about the damage. If you actually go back in time 100 years, they talked about boxers being punch drunk all the time. There were movies, if you go watch Marlon Brando in 1954 and On the Waterfront, he's playing a punch drunk boxer whose life is hell. And that was just, everyone knew it and it was okay. But as sports became more profitable and more about money, that narrative hurt, was not good for sports. And so, and sports basically, is driving a lot of media these days. And so it just became this sort of afterthought that when I was banging my head in the 90s and early 2000s, it was never brought up. And so and back then there was no reason for anyone to talk about how damaged they were. People hid it, right? If you ended up being brain damaged from playing sports or having dementia, everybody hid it. So we didn't have these examples, and it's taken 15 years of courageous families and individuals coming forward to say, no, I am the evidence. And so there's a lot of reasons why this all feels new, but it's really just all been hidden under the surface because there haven't been good reasons to talk about it.
Well, in your point, you just, the fact that, you name the sport, right? The NFL, NHL, boxing, whatever. Why have they been so successful is it all about money, or are they actively pushing down the narrative? Because there's, as we look at the research that you and Dr. Ann McKee have produced over the years, we look at the activities of the Concussion Legacy Foundation, working with parents like us and other actors, and pushing Flag for 14. The message is out there, but it doesn't seem to resonate, and people still do not seem to get that. I cringe when I watch football now, and I see these young men taking these enormous hits. Why do you think they have been so successful on our side, your foundation and all the other foundations represent of this, that we just, do we need to become more socially active or something to get this out?
Yeah. It's we're outgunned, financially. We think about, the NFL and college football are 90 of the top 100 most watched broadcasts every year in America. Right. So they just have a much bigger megaphone than we do. But there's also been there's a lot of money there. What's actually happening over the last week, and if you want to jump to my Twitter, Chris Nowinski 1 to see what's been happening, there's a big expose in New York Times. There's been an organized international effort to bury CTE and claim it's not real. And it's been led by not only American scientists, but Australian scientists and European scientists, where they basically are either industry friendly or they're just naive, but they were given a pulpit, put in charge of this international consensus statement. And it's been really hard to undo that. But even just this morning, it was discovered that the Australian Football League, who the number one guy who was the CT denier, a guy named Paul McCrory, he was their advisor. He just has been exposed for multiple accounts of plagiarism. Now they're finding that he has led multi-million-dollar studies of former Australian rules football players. One that started 8 years ago that was all over the news. They've never published anything, and they're refusing to give the players their data. And so we're talking about right now, it looks like they saw bad findings and buried it, and it's on them to prove otherwise. But we're talking about pretty sophisticated, not only research and media efforts to downplay all of this. And so I'm not surprised this is hard to do. This is like big tobacco. It took a long time, but the evidence is on our side, and people like you are sharing your story and bringing new levels of sophistication and energy to the cause. And so we're eventually going to win. It's just a question of time.
It's funny. I thought you were going to go the other way with that gentleman about maybe he became more CTE aware. But you bring this up a lot. Julie Stam brings it up in a lot about how this research is definitely one-sided. Like, these helmet companies will say that, hey, our helmets, help reduce concussions, but they won't release the data they use to get to that, that conclusion. And they obfuscate so much. So, it just becomes, a huge dilemma. But I do believe you're right. It is like big tobacco. And I do think the evidence is on our side. And I do believe a lot of it's going to come from, educating parents and getting them to understand the risks so that they stop their kids from participating in this. And one of the points, I'd like to, talk about next is talk about your Flag to 14 program, right? So much has gone on with, understanding what is going on with our kids. And we feel that your Flag to 14 program is exactly what needs to happen. And we look at what happened with USA Hockey when they did away with no check hockey. Youth participation actually increased because of the fact that parents thought that kids were that they were better protected. What can we do to get this to be recognized as like the way to better protect our kids? And does this take legislature? We'll talk about that in a little bit. But what can we do to get programs like yours out there for the communities to pick up and adopt?
Yeah, so flag football under 14 is one of the harder challenges we face. So the scientific basis for it is twofold. One, we've now studied the brains of nearly 800 football players. And what we found is there's a relationship between the number of years you play and whether or not you get CTE, like smoking and lung cancer, like many other environmental exposures, sunburns and skin cancer. And so the only way or the best way we have to prevent it is limit the number of years you play, also modifying the game while we do it. So you can't quit on the end. You have to start at the beginning. So you start later. It's like driving or these other laws for kids that you have to be a certain age to take a certain risk. Football is unique in that there's no national governing body who owns the space. Soccer, hockey, US Soccer, USA Hockey, USA Lacrosse, they all set rules and they've all set minimums for when you can start blasting a kid in the head hundreds of times. Football hasn't, because the reality is football is a bunch of small capitalist organizations that are all sort of trying to, their living is based on how many kids they recruit. And the head of Pop Warner has said if he set an age minimum, because there's demand for tackle football, it would drive all the kids and families who want to play tackle to their competitors and put themselves out of business. So football is not going to save this. The other problem is that the NFL is not going to save this because their data says most kids pick the sport they're going to follow their entire life in elementary school, and they're more likely to pick a sport they play than another one. So they're creating fans by having kids play tackle football young. So the industry is against us in every possible way. Flag under 14 is trying to first just convince parents, like, look, there's never a good reason to hit your kid in the head 500 times. There's real consequences. We can show them to you. I have a bunch of Hall of Famers who will tell you, even if you want your kid to be good and have a successful career, it doesn't help you to play tackle football young, before puberty, before they've grown, before they can even get in the weight room. They're not playing real football. They're playing some bastardized, insane, game that is nothing like high school or college football. So how do we do it? Education gets us part of the way there, and youth football is down maybe 30% over the last decade, but it's not down enough. There's still 1 million kids playing. There's still 1 million kids getting hundreds of hits to the head each year and getting CTE. So I think legislation is the next place we need to approach. And we are getting more and more support. In fact, we just did a survey, almost 80% of Americans support that kids shouldn't play before 14. The problem is the 20% who do and have their kids playing will fight to the death to say, my kid, you don't tell me how to raise my kid. That's what we're in the sort of culture war. And so we're going to have to find new ways to get this out there because these kids don't deserve to get CT.
No, and in my book, even though I am guilty of it in my ignorance, once you're informed, I think it's a form of child endangerment. I mean, there is absolute research that you have funded, that we have put together that highly documents the correlation between, the same trauma developing brain gets from a car accident, skateboard incidents, and football is the same trauma that's been correlated with mental illness but changes to white matter over the years. And
I didn't say the second point. CT is one reason, and then concussion-induced mental health issues is the other one for there's black and white evidence for.
I honestly believe this is something that parents can grab onto, that coaches can understand. I mean, my son's coach left football because he was part of the reason that my son played. He talked to him every year. He was the blindside guy. When I went to him a month after my son's passing and I explained to him that, Mac really didn't want to play football, but he didn't know how to tell us. He didn't want to let anybody down. And he goes, Bruce, he says, not only did I not know that, he says, tell me about this subconcussive trauma thing. And we went to how Mac was the only back-to-back contact sports guy at his high school. Plus he snowboarded. And he left football, but he understood, that part about mental illness. So, given the correlation between that, and I think parents, when you mention mental illness in a parent, they get it. They might not get CTE right now.
Right.
But I agree. Think there's something there that we could grab onto. What are your suggestions on how we as a community and the Concussion Legacy Foundation can maybe, use that point to kind of, really grab these parents and to get them to make better decisions?
Yeah, I think, I know you've been funding some good research, and there was just a great study published out of Children's Hospital in Ottawa that found, between kids 5 to 18, the control group was orthopedic injuries, which was very wise, because the question is your sport going away causing the mental health problems, or is it the actual injury itself? People with brain injuries versus other injuries are 40% more likely to have new onset mental illness, and included things as severe as suicidal ideation and schizophrenia. So if we can explain that to parents and we can tell them the stories, and including having those young people tell those stories themselves, because with our helpline at the Concussion Legacy Foundation, the hardest cases are parents reaching out about their 14-year-old child who has just lost their mind, they suicidal attempts, cutting themselves, all these things, all new after concussion, completely different kid. If we can get them through those next few years, they will recover. But if we can't, we lose some. And if parents realize that their own kids may be only one head impact away from losing them, I think we might get a little further and realize that accidental concussions are already going to happen. The idea that we're actually putting them in places where they're destined to get them, feels like a bad idea. And now that I've got 2 kids, you can see them in a little picture right where my hand is. They ain't getting hit in the head ever on purpose, ever. And it's just gonna be very different than what I did with myself. And I remember fighting my mom over it and letting me play football. We need to have parents trust their instincts that no one should be hitting their kid in the head.
And I think you're spot on. We have a book now that's in final editing about youth contact sports and broken brains, and we're attacking this mental illness angle because we're finding out that's what parents can really understand. And I noticed that you have led the way in your book. You've mentioned several times that more research needs to be done on children and the effects of concussive sports on children. What type of research? I know that we are talking now with Boston University about funding some AI applications to see what changes in white matter, which is heavily correlated with mental illness, can we find? What other research that you think, because as you stated so much, there is no in vivo look at CTE at this time, even though the technologies can be looked. But maybe mental illness, we can identify some of the causality early enough to get parents and society to go, look, just like you said, seatbelts and going biking and skiing with a helmet back in the 70s, playing hockey with a helmet back in the 70s wasn't cool, right? But now it's like mandatory. No parent would even think. I mean, Mac, my son played all his sports with a helmet. I knew, it wasn't right. So, what else can we do on that? To maybe is there a chance that maybe looking at some of the new research that you might be doing can help, bring that link between mental illness and brain damage and light, where parents start getting it and saying, well, this ain't an adult condition. This is not my kid's still young. Nothing can hurt him at this time, when it's absolutely untrue that their child is suffering every time he puts on that helmet.
I fully support, and I think it's a great idea, and I appreciate that you're looking into investing in this AI application looking into white matter. So one of the reasons that CTE is caught on is because it's a disease that we can see. You get these brain images with these brown spots, and it makes sense. Oh, that's brain damage. and we can come up with a number system, a 1 to 4 scale. White matter, we don't have that. And we need that, but it's too complicated to do by hand. And so AI might be able to give us a white matter scale that'll help people appreciate just how much brain damage they have. And so that would be one thing to invest in. Another thing that, the other part of this is trying to just figure out the correlations of how early some of these things start. So Dr. McKee is finishing a draft of a paper looking at about 160 young people who died before 35. Of which more than half had CT, and the other half we're talking about the other things that they had, including white matter damage. And there's so many incredible, horrible stories about kids who were amazing people, got into the best colleges for sports and all these other things, valedictorians of their high school class, all this, and then they end up dead. Some of them by suicide. Some of them, like I was just talking to someone about, a case who murdered his mother, and blamed his father for it. And like, there's just like so many horrible stories that we are tying to the brain damage. And we need to keep putting faces to this issue like you are with Mac, so people can understand it's not this abstract concept. Like, these are grieving families. These are gaps in the universe because of the choices that we've made as a culture. And we need to make better choices.
Chris, I couldn't say it more succinctly. I mean, the gaps in our lives, in society, the futures that these kids could have contributed to, and now have been taken away. And we have talked to so many children. The other day, talking to a young man, and he's telling me how he woke up in the hospital from one concussion. He can't even count the ones he had. Tried to quit. Dad made him, kept playing. Now he thinks it's cool to be an MMA guy. He's been in treatment for years. And, and moving on on the mental illness aspect, there's also this huge gap in education. I mean, when that kid was telling me he's been in therapy for 10 years, I said, all right, therapy for 10 years. Has anybody ever asked you about your concussive sports history? He said, no. My therapist, because when you lose a child, you end up in therapy. Let me tell you, she told me that she had until I walked in, she had no idea that the young men that she had been treating could have been in front of her because of their contact sports. And she was sending them back out to football because she thought it was good for them. They loved it. It was healthy. And that was the reason that they were in front of her. What can we do? And we notice these gaps in education, the medical community, the athletic training community, not just with mental illness, but talking about, subconcussive trauma. How can we, I think a lot of this is education too. And not just raising hell like the Concussion Legacy Foundation. Your PSAs with Brett Favre, that video that you have is amazing. But how do we start also educating the medical, the athletic training, the coaching, and the psychiatric professions to say, look, when you see children with mental illness, it's not just because they had a horrific event when they were young or they have this genetic predisposition. You need to ask them about contact sports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a harder nut to crack, to change medical practice, because it's expensive, and a lot, medical schools all train differently. And not all organizations are friendly to this idea, to be perfectly honest. Like, there have been some, like there's a group called the Sports Neuropsychology Association. They, the sporting groups seem to be more on the side of sports than the side of the athletes, in my opinion, and the way they talk about this. That's where they get their prestige. That's where they get their jobs. That's where they get their money. Plus, you don't get into that world unless you're a sports fan. But not saying that they all issues. There's plenty of people there that are on the right side of this, but their leadership right now is completely on the wrong side of this. And I look forward to collaborating with you on figuring that out. We do continuing medical education conferences each year with Boston University. We aren't getting enough people showing up, but you're right that we're actually starting to develop questionnaires that we hope to be able to share widely, to say, if someone comes in, you need to be asking about not only their brain injury history, but their exposure history to repetitive head impacts. And that is going to help your differential diagnosis of what's wrong with them. And you're going to find that a lot of people have all these problems due to the hits that they take. But that's a long, multi-decade process. And we sort of have to go one specialty by one specialty.
I'm not waiting multi-decades. I don't have that long. So we're going to have to get that battle going. And on that point, the CDC, and I read a lot of papers that have been published by NIH, but the CDC is supposed to be, the center of knowledge and recommendations to the medical parental communities. It's where we all go for information. In my opinion, the Concussion Legacy Foundation has done far more than our national organizations in understanding this threat to our children and getting the word out. I go to the CDC's, concussion guides. I mean, they're pretty, they're kind of vanilla. It's pretty much, common sense stuff that most parents should know, but they do not underline the risks to mental illness, to brain damage, to CTE. They announce they say they kind of dance around the possibilities. Yet there's no guidance for parents on when should my kid start playing contact sports. What kind of contact sports, when is it too much? Can they do back to back? There's no guidelines for them. And you are one of the few organizations who go out there and say, look, it's 14. Can you explain to us the rationale behind the 14 age limit? And what should, and then after that, we'll talk about why wouldn't the CDC, in the name of protecting our children, take your recommendations, which is based on science and research, and enforce them to the American public?
Yeah, well, I'll defend the CDC a bit here because, having worked with them for 15 years, I know that there are limits to what they're allowed to do in terms of advocacy. They are allowed to create educational documents, and they did do a great job of creating their coach and parent education video that is mandated in a lot of states. So millions of people see that a year. And they actually, gave us sort of an implicit endorsement because they asked me to be the voiceover on it. So, okay. Yeah. So, and then they also put out the first ever CT fact sheets in 2019 that do say CT is caused by hits to the head. So they've been within what they're allowed to do. They've actually done a pretty good job on this, and it's up to groups like us to get the word out of what they're doing in some ways. They even funded a study that showed that the average person in tackle football gets hit in the head, 380 sometimes a year, and in flag it's like 8 times a year. And they did that because there was doctors out there saying that they were equally bad or equally good. And they said they did the definitive study that said, no, you're out of your mind. So anyway, well, 14, the reason we focus on 14 as a minimum for exposing your child to repetitive head impacts has a lot to do with neurological development, right? Like if you actually just step back and think of who my child was at 8 and who they were at 13 and their capacity to think and be a member of society and interact socially and remember, and that's because their brain is literally changing every day. And so it's probably the worst time in the world to be whacking them in the head all the time and giving them brain injuries. So there's that they're protected neurologically. Then there's the sports infrastructure and risk. I mean, there are 30 medical professionals at every NFL game because it's so dangerous. There are 0 or near 0 at any level at a game. And so no one is out advocating. Your coaches aren't trained on either football or concussions or anything. So and a lot of sports are private before high school, where they're more in the school system, where there are educators who actually care and are looking at them. So there's that infrastructure part. And then there's just the development part of when we talk about concussions, your child can't recognize their own concussion very easily because they're a child who's had a brain injury and their brain is supposed to help them evaluate. They don't even know they have a brain in their head and what it does at that age. So giving the odds that they'll be able to tell you when they're hurt is so limited before at least 14. And there's certainly no concept of informed consent that they know what they're getting into. And so the risks are just so bad. And I think it was actually someone from the CDC that said it very well. It's almost impossible to know how damaging these brain injuries are to kids because we can never know who they were supposed to become. And everybody's an N of 1 in that situation. So anyway, that's a quick list. But as you know, I guess we're getting close to where we have to wrap here.
No, and I know you got a lot going on. So no, and I think that helps us with a lot of the conversations that we're having right now with coaches, with athletes, and with parents ourselves. So as we close out, Chris, number one, I want to thank you personally for what you're doing to raise awareness of this unbelievable impact that concussive and subconcussive trauma has had on our society and on our children. And as you close out, can you tell us a little bit more about what does the Concussion Legacy Foundation have planned, and in the future? And then how can we help get the word out about what you're doing to help educate parents and coaches on just waiting until our kids are ready for them to to start contact sports? Because I honestly wish we had more time, but
I'm actually, I got a call. A former athlete's got mental health issues right now, so I don't want to leave him. Call him right now, but visit our website at concussionfoundation.org to learn everything. But we're really focused on kids right now. One example, we have a program we started with Bob Costas that trains broadcasters. We finally had our first professional, our first network reach out and say, educate all of our broadcasters so that when a concussion happens in soccer, rugby, this is actually in the UK, all these sports that they're covering, they talk about it right so that kids and parents learn. They don't, when people get knocked out in sports, they often just clam up or ignore it and give the wrong information. So we're focused on making sure you get the right information from your TV. And then we're going to be working with you later on this year. We're going to really dive in to more efforts of prevention. The research is accelerating really quickly. And we think this is the right time to make a push for not just football, moving to under 14, but a lot of other sports so that we can prevent concussions and this repetitive head impacts and prevent the really, really, really awful stories that we know because of families like you that have shared them.
Chris, I really cannot thank you enough for coming on the show and helping us get the word out. We will definitely be pushing people forward. And for our audience, if you know anybody that's suffering from mental illness that has a concussive sports background, we highly encourage you to reach out to Concussion Legacy Foundation. They have a network of concussion specialists that they can direct your kids to, because unlike I met myself, who didn't know that there was such a thing as a concussion specialist and relied on doctors, you need the best help you can, and these folks are outstanding. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show. We look forward to working with you and the Concussion Legacy Foundation in the future. And thank you so much for taking care of our son.
Thanks, Bruce. Look forward to talking again soon.
Take care.